Welcome to another edition of Represent NYC. I'm Mark Levin, New York City Council Member representing the 7th District in Northern Manhattan, covering parts of Washington Heights, West Harlem, Morningside Heights, and the Upper West Side. We're coming to you today from Studio 1A in the world headquarters of Manhattan Neighborhood Network in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. We are going in deep on a critical issue, the fate of mom and pop stores, of small businesses, which are the lifeblood of our communities and are closing at an alarming rate. And I am thrilled that we're joined today by an all-star panel of experts on this topic, including Rud Morales, owner of beloved Inwood establishment 3805. We're joined also by Armando Moritz-Chapelliquen, who is the Director of Economic Development at the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, better known as ANHD. And finally, Daniel Alam, who is an expert on economic development and technology at the office of the great Borough President, Gail Brewer. Our mom and pop businesses aren't just important for local economies as a source of jobs and economic vitality. They are part of the fabric of our neighborhoods, our legacy, our history, our culture, the soul of neighborhoods throughout Manhattan. And they are under threat like never before, facing challenges on so many fronts. Sky-high rents, competition from the internet, rising costs on many fronts. They are closing at an alarming rate, with vacancy rates as high as 20% or more in many neighborhoods. This is a major threat to our communities, and we're going to go in deep today, looking at the importance of these businesses, the challenges they face, and most importantly, what we can do to save them. Rud, we're going to start off with you. Tell us about your business, your connection to the community, and why you think your work uptown in Inwood is so important to the broader neighborhood.
Well, I represent, thank you for having me actually, Mark, thank you. I represent the small business community, the restaurant industry, which is being displaced pretty much. One of the most challenging situations that we have right now is the rent. When I got my location, I believe it was in 2009. It took me 2 years actually to open. It took me 2 years because it's a triple net type of lease that we have. Triple net is mean the tenant take responsibility for everything, including any type of violation, the bill out, all the aspect of the construction aspect. When you take a lease from any landlord over here, uptown, right now, another challenge that we're having is the rezoning, which is going to be a little subject that I want to touch because it's part of the lease. But back then, when most of the restaurant, small pop shop tried to open, they didn't solve this particular situation coming into the neighborhood. There was no education, there was no information, and pretty much everyone signed a lease based in a triple net type of lease. Triple net type of lease, back then it was costing $50 the square foot. Right now we're going into 300, up to 300,
and so
350.
what year was it that you opened, and what was the rent at that point?
In 2009, I took it up the lease, it was $8,000. Right now, we are in $13,400.
So your monthly rent is $13,400.
Correct.
That is quite a burden.
That's without the real estate taxes. Because the real estate taxes, you have to pay separately. That you have to pay the real estate taxes to the landlord.
Okay, I want to hear more about that in a minute, but I also want to go to Armando, who has a global view of nonprofits throughout Manhattan and the 5 boroughs, of small businesses throughout Manhattan and the 5 boroughs. Tell us about this landscape, about how important they are as a vehicle for immigrants and other New Yorkers to build economic independence and all the great benefits they offer to our city.
Sure. So, and also thank you for having us.
Of course.
So one of the things that's actually interesting is that ANHD, the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, is historically done housing issues. And so the reason we actually got into small business issues is because a lot of our member-based groups all across the city were coming to us and saying, we're losing our small businesses too. And we actually haven't thought about how do we organize and engage those folks to also do things about issues of displacement and gentrification and rezonings that are coming to neighborhoods all across the city. one of the things that we collectively came together and understood as a coalition that we formed later on, United for Small Business New York City, was this recognition that small businesses are part of the cultural identity of our neighborhoods. And one of the I guess, mantras that we all collectively identify with is this recognition that small business displacement is really cultural displacement. When you lose a small business, when you lose a mom and pop business, you lose a part of the neighborhood and you lose a part of the community. Contrast that with a vacant storefront, and there's clearly a sense of loss when you lose those small businesses and there's essentially nothing happening in these vacant spaces. So particularly for low-income communities and communities of color, they're getting it the worst, essentially, because they have the least amount of protections, they have the least amount of engagement with the city, so they're least aware of the programs or services that would either be available to help them, or there aren't the policies and programs in place to help those businesses to survive in a changing real estate landscape.
Yes, indeed. Daniel, tell us about the economic impact of small businesses, what they mean to our borough, and why they're so important to our neighborhoods.
Small businesses are one of the driving economic drivers, most important economic drivers in Manhattan. They employ the most people, far more than larger businesses. Businesses that have under 100 or even under 10 employees make up a very large percentage of our local workforce. And for a lot of people, they are a tool to break into a higher economic class. You see people who come to New York and start up businesses, immigrants, mostly, and it really is their sole source of income. And like Armando was saying, they become a fabric of our local communities.
And when they close, it's not just a loss for the owner, but there can be many employees who have also lost their livelihood.
Exactly, and you also see small businesses have a higher tendency of shopping local. It becomes a ecosystem in and of itself that sustains itself. When we see these, especially online retail, drawing money away from our communities, and we're sending our dollars, to warehouses that are in other states, that are in other countries, that is money that's never going to be circulated back into our local communities. So,
and it's a great point, because chains probably have a global source of their raw materials, their ingredients, if they're restaurants, and the local stores are more likely probably to purchase those materials from other small businesses right here in the 5 boroughs. Exactly. So there's really an economic multiplier benefit from these small businesses. Rud, so tell us about the biggest challenge that you are facing. Would it be rising rents? What's the biggest challenge to the business success for 3805?
Right now, the biggest challenge that we have is the rezoning, because where I am located is by Sherman Creek area. Sherman Creek area is basically the main focus of the rezoning area. So right now, I have friends on the business, actually, that they was building just a car wash around 2 corners from me. They had to stop everything because the landlord told him, probably I'm going to be erecting a tower in 5 years from now. So the investment that he was putting into that property that was over $250,000 is money that is gone. That's like one simple example. Then you have some of the business that have been having the challenge in that they already took a loan, personal loan, into their house, personal line of credit, and they being stuck with a situation that in 2 or 3 years from now, they're gonna be gone. So the rent keep increasing, real estate keep increasing. Triple net type of lease, when the landlord tell you you have to do capital improvement to my property, but in 3 or 4 years from now, you're gonna be gone. So there has to be a law or some kind of resource that can help a small business to survive.
So normally businesses would want a 10 or 15-year lease, maybe even an option to renew longer, so they can make investments. They can spend money on a new kitchen, and they know that they'll have 10 or 15 or more years to recoup that investment. But what you're saying is in Inwood, or in your area of Inwood, really on the eastern side of the neighborhood, businesses are not being given any kind of long-term leases or security, that they may be gone into it.
They do have. The problem is a triple net type of lease, there is not a clause into the lease that it says it protects you from the rezoning. So your lease can be broken just in 2 seconds. It doesn't matter if you have 20, 30 years type of lease. if you don't have that clause inside your lease, pretty much the landlord can throw you out. They can break your lease anytime soon.
It's a problem of unfavorable leases. It sounds like you're familiar with this, Armando.
Yeah, just to bounce off of that point, I mean, I feel like a lot of these particular issues that are being brought up is indicative of the larger trend that we're seeing in a lot of places across the city, which is the fact that small businesses, just even more globally than small businesses, are commercial tenants. And as commercial tenants, don't really have rights outside of a lease. And I mean, you know, using the context of what's happening on the residential side, where there's all this tremendous advocacy happening around, you know, tenant protections on a statewide scale, that's built out of a lot of organizing and advocacy that's happened in the city and across the state. We haven't seen that same scale of organizing and advocacy on the small business side on this broader recognition that we need to create rights and protections for tenants, because ultimately what ends up happening is the situation that was just mentioned, that if you don't have a lease, if you don't have specific terms written into your lease, you're essentially without any protections, any rights, and you could be displaced at the whim of a landlord. And that's really not a favorable position to operate a business.
Right. As many problems as residential tenants face, and they are severe, though we're making great strides in Albany now with improvements to the rent laws for residential tenants. For commercial tenants, they are incredibly vulnerable, even more vulnerable than residential tenants, with far fewer laws protecting them, and really offering the ability of landlords to, at their whim, double, triple, quadruple rent when leases are up, or even simply say, sorry, we don't want you back, with really no recourse for tenants. And just as landlords of residential tenants, the bad actors among them can engage in harassment of residential tenants, it unfortunately happens for commercial tenants as well. Again, the commercial tenants just have fewer protections. And they can be incredibly vulnerable.
Yeah, just to actually bounce off of that point. I mean, when our Coalition United for Small Business, New York City came together a couple of years ago, one of the first things we actually did was look into this issue of harassment, because we were seeing it happening all across the city, where the same tactics of harassment that were being used on residential tenants were being employed against commercial tenants. And to the point of
such as what kind of tactics?
Turning off heat, turning off water, turning off electricity during, you know, busy dinner rushes. So, you know, how are you going to wash dishes if you don't have any water? How are you going to serve water if you don't have running water? How are you going to operate a business, you know, that needs lighting or music or, you know, any electricity to function if your landlord is turning that stuff off, and it keeps happening on a recurring basis every Saturday night, you know, for a month. And so one of the first things that our coalition did was push to pass legislation that actually defined commercial tenant harassment. And granted, it's a very, very small and narrow definition, but one of the things that we've been doing since then has been pushing to both expand that law and expand that definition of harassment, but then also expanding legal services for small business owners.
I'm in deep with you on that one. Just as we know, many residential tenants have to confront evictions without the benefit of an attorney. Unfortunately, the same thing is occurring with commercial tenants who are in eviction proceedings against a high-powered landlord who is going to have an attorney, who's going to have significant resources at their disposal. And not surprisingly, those proceedings often end up in disaster for the commercial tenant. Now, we've scored a big win for residential tenants by passing a right to counsel for tenants in housing court, so that now all tenants will have the protection of attorney, residential tenants, when they face an eviction. We need to do the same for commercial tenants, so there's a level playing field anytime a mom and pop store faces a life or death ruling in court. Daniel, tell us what you see as the biggest challenges facing mom and pop stores in Manhattan.
I think we've touched on one of the key factors here in rent. You see rising rents around the city, where you see mom and pop store, a storefront that's been in a neighborhood contributing to its community for 20 plus years, that clearly has a healthy financial backbone, and then their rents get raised 500% sometimes, and they cannot afford to stay in their space. And
500%.
You'd be surprised. More.
Incredible.
Yeah, it's a huge problem that we're facing. I think that, you know, having legal aid to have a more even negotiation field is definitely part of it. But there's a flaw in our in our negotiation structure as it is. The landlord just has too many powers, that has too much influence over the negotiation process itself. They can wait it out, and then the tenant's lease is done. They can be incommunicative with the tenant themselves. And in many cases, you see tenants that don't actually have leases, and they're an invisible part of the population that's not talked about enough. They're people and families who are in a space on a month-to-month, week-to-week basis, and they don't have even the most basic tenant protections that we have in place.
So if you don't have a lease, you could be out any day for
Just
any
like that.
reason.
Yeah.
No protection.
And we see this a lot in especially immigrant populations. And when we've, our office has put together a small business task force that we've been meeting for the past few months, and we've been talking about a number of these issues. And one of the things that came up in the course of our discussions was when we discuss a lot of these different protections that we want to put in place, we also have to think about undocumented immigrants who might not be able to take advantage of some of these benefits, or aren't as trusting of the government, or fear that number of the programs that we suggest may actually end up reporting them to ICE or other situations. Those are absolutely unwanted outcomes. So, it's a very complex issue with all these different factors that you really have to weigh evenly.
And you were going to say, Rud?
I want to add something. He's mentioned about the rent. Most of the situation that is happening, a lot of the situations that have been happening over there, landlord doesn't want to negotiate with the tenant, the existing tenants. If I build a restaurant or store and it's in good shape, the landlord prefer to throw you out and rent it to the next tenant for key money, as they call it. Key money is basically me coming and offer the landlord $50,000 plus the 3 months of deposit. So there is like a pretty clear negotiation that is happening in the small business community when the landlord has his right, he has his opportunity to throw you out. Doesn't matter how much money you have invested, and come back with a new tenant. They're going to offer them $100,000, $150,000, basically for the new tenant to take the space plus the 3 rent. There is no law that protect, because this is you feel like it's an illegal transaction when you taking advantage of the money that already invested. And you have to remember, this is capital improvement.
Absolutely.
Because all the store pretty much, and I am in construction, I can tell you what it costs you to build a space. It doesn't matter if it's clothing store or it's a restaurant store. You go through gas line, it's a capital improvement. You go into 3-phase electrical process, it costs you $100,000. I'm telling you, CO of application, it costs you about $20,000 just architectural fee for one of the application. Then you have to go to 3 or 5 different applications. So you're spending about $40,000 just in architectural fee without you touching the space.
Really, the tenants are at an incredible disadvantage at the moment in which they sign leases or renew leases. There is a bill in the New York City Council that has been introduced session after session after session, which gets exactly at this problem to rebalance the playing field for lease renewals. It's called the Small Business Job Survival Act. And your boss, Gail Brewer, has been a champion of this from her days when she was a city council member representing the Upper West Side. Could you please tell us about the powerful idea behind the Small Business Job Survival Act?
Absolutely, and Gail was actually, even before she was a council member on Ruth Messenger's staff, she helped draft the original version. Before me.
Okay. But in the 80s.
I think in the late 80s.
This bill has been pending now for 30 plus years.
Exactly, and there is a reason for that as well. I think there are a number of clauses within the Small Business Job Survival Act that a number of legal experts think would make it impossible to, get through the court system. So one of the things that we have to look at as advocates and as policymakers is we want to make sure that we create change that will help our small businesses now. I mean, the crisis is absolutely a current threat, and we cannot wait for a prolonged legal battle. Speaking kind of to your capital improvement point, it's not just capital improvement. A lot of these businesses are only viable in their location. If you're forcing someone out of that location, they're not going to be able to restart somewhere else. So it's also a matter of the fiscal health. But one of the core tenets of the SBJSA is to find different ways to change the commercial lease negotiation process to create stickiness so that a tenant has more rights and can fight and negotiate on an equal playing field. And that's absolutely something that we need to consider. And we have to consider new ways of doing that.
Yes, I totally agree.
One of the one of the points of the SBJSA, which I think does need to be changed a little bit, is the arbitration clause, the idea of a guaranteed arbitration period. And that's solely because it's too expensive. It's a process that would add to the cost of small businesses, and most small businesses wouldn't be able to afford the prolonged legal counsel that you would need. And I think that goes back to the point where we need to have a greater legal aid in place for our small businesses.
Armando?
One of the things that I just wanted to add into this, because I think it's actually relevant to the earlier point you brought up about, and I will say we, but I also mean like the city as a whole, we do not know how many businesses are operating today without leases. And one of the main challenges that we've struggled with a little bit when it comes to the Small Business Job Survival Act is that it creates this right to renewal, which sounds like a good idea, but that would only apply for leases signed after the date of the passage of the legislation. Like, it can't go backwards, it can't be retroactive. And so there is the possibility that, let's say hypothetically legislation passes, a property owner will say, well, I can still throw this business out that's here right now because the lease that we signed, or maybe they don't have a lease, I can just get rid of them because this legislation only applies for leases written into the future. That's something that, not knowing how many businesses are operating without a lease right now is, it's a question that I think needs to be answered in terms of considering what the potential unintended consequences could be for the legislation. But I would also just echo the point about, like, we do need to rebalance the playing field on lease negotiations, because it really is one of those points where business owners are going into, as you had mentioned before, going into lease negotiations with property owners and landlords who have a lot of, financial and legal firepower with them, and the business owners are going in, trying to run their business, trying to earn a living, and they don't necessarily have the assistance or the backing of the city, at least until relatively recently, when the city launched the Commercial Lease Assistance Program, which I'm also happy to say that our coalition had pushed for a couple years ago, actually building out from the commercial tenant harassment legislation, because there was this recognition that we do need to be doing more to even the playing field to make sure that business owners have the resources they need to operate in New York.
Absolutely. So I chair the Health Committee overseeing the Health Department, which is in charge of restaurant inspections, the famous restaurant grades, and there are many other city agencies which have regulatory oversight of small businesses. Mm-hmm. And small business owners often complain about either the intensity of those inspections or oversight, or the fact that they're inconsistent mm-hmm. and unfair. And I do want to hear from you, Rud, about your experience with oversight from the city or from the health department. Have you felt that's been fair and consistent?
Actually, the health department is one of the best agency, on my experience, to work with. We go through one process that is called the March operation. This is the most difficult one to have. We usually go 3 times a year through that inspection. It involves 5 city agencies: Fire Department, Department of Building, NYPD, Liquor Authority, and Health Department. Health Department is really easy going. You are not ready for the inspection, they show up at your job site, at your place, at your restaurant. If you are not ready, they say, I'm going to be back in 30 minutes, just to make sure that you have all your proper documentation in order. Because most of the time when they go inside a location is the time of the cleaning process. And this conversation is a conversation that I have different forums, community board also. Basically, yes, the health department is one of the best city agencies to work with. They are really flexible. There was one time actually in one forum that we have that I complained because most of the information, they don't have a Spanish speaking inspector when they go to the, to the Spanish community. If you go to Chinatown, they have the Chinese inspector in those areas. For Uptown, for example, based on my experience, most of my guys, most of my fellow business owners, they don't speak English. Even myself, we speak English with an accent mm-hmm. properly. When it comes to the inspection, there is information that is misplaced, there is information that is not accurate, there is information, and the business fell. So I believe, yes, health department is flexible, it's a great agency, but they should have inspector specific for certain areas. Mm-hmm. If you are in the Spanish community, try to send most of the Spanish speaking inspector to those
Absolutely.
areas.
So, and I wonder, Armando, whether you have formulated a plan in any way to reform the way any of the regulatory agencies oversee small businesses. Of course, we want protection for food safety and fire safety. We have to keep the public safe. The public demands it. The restaurant grades are very popular. We just want to make sure these are applied fairly in a way that's not an excessive burden to small businesses. Do you have a reform agenda related to this regulation?
Not in particular, but I think that one of the themes that I would just want to echo is just the specific issue of cultural competency. Like, I mean, the city, if the city is going to be going and doing this enforcement, they should know that the communities that they're going into, if the predominant language is in English, and they should have inspectors ready to speak the language of the folks who are in that neighborhood or of the business owners who are running that neighborhood. Because that is also a complaint that we've heard from a lot of businesses in other parts of the city where, you know, the inspectors will show up and they won't speak the same language, or there will be a miscommunication about when to come back, and then, you know, businesses will fail because there's not actual clarity on who came, which agency, what's being inspected, what's going on, when are they coming back. And this also speaks to just like this larger issue, which is not necessarily something that any one particular policy can fix, but just the relationship that business owners have with the city needs to change, specifically in the context of what we were just talking about before with harassment and displacement, and, you know, this issue of, you know, concentration of power in the pockets of property owners and landlords. If business owners are dealing with harassment, they're not going to call the city if they don't see the city as a resource or as an ally in them operating their business. And so going from the current context of business owners dealing with regulations and only seeing the city in the context of, oh, these are the people who are going to say I fail or I pass, I think we need to focus on making sure that process is smooth, but we also need to make sure that the larger process or the larger relationship is one of, you know, support between the city and business owners.
And we are almost out of time, but Daniel, I want to ask you about a powerful idea on the table to help prevent the epidemic of vacant storefronts in neighborhoods all over Manhattan, which is to put a tax on vacancy, a vacancy tax to incentivize building owners to bring in tenants and to lower the rent if that's what it takes. Does the borough president have a position on that policy?
You know, there are a few things with a vacancy tax that, you know, have to be debated. I think that, you know, one of the issues that you have to look at is markets are not, you know, always consistent. You have housing crises, you have dips in the economy where you'll see trends in different neighborhoods of vacancies being a natural progression. I think what we really need to do first, and this is something that we've been working on for a while, we actually have an intro in City Council right now that we're working on hammering out the last details on, but creating a vacancy database that tracks vacancies through storefronts throughout the cities in specific areas.
It is incredible that we as a city don't actually know how many storefronts are vacant.
Yeah. Actually, a few years ago, our office did a survey of Broadway from the Battery to Inwood and counted 188 different vacancies. But if you look at bids, you'll have a different rate. You look at side streets versus avenues, you'll have different rates. So I think having a vacancy database where we can really look at granular data on what the crisis really is will allow us to create targeted policies that help specific industries and neighborhoods.
I couldn't agree more. And I wish we could continue this conversation because there's so much to talk about, such a critical topic of saving our mom and pop stores all over the borough. I want to thank you, Daniel Alam of the Manhattan Borough President's Office, for joining us today. Thank you so much. And thank you, Armando Moritz-Chapelliquen from Association for Neighborhood Housing Development.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rud Morales, owner of 3805 in Inwood. Thank you for this exciting and important discussion. Thanks to our viewers for watching another edition of Represent NYC. Again, I'm Mark Levin, New York City Council. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.